Good day. Before I proceed with this program, this is just a reminder that if you are following us on Rumble, that is to say if you're watching videos by the Duran or Alexander Mercouris or Alex Christoforou on Rumble, then if you go to the top of the video and see the red maroon button there and press that button, that will take you directly to our locals homepage where you can join our thriving locals community. And if you decide to become an active member, you can comment on the threads of our articles, publish your exclusive content, your own exclusive content, and participate in my Wednesday live streams, which take place every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. Well, again, this program, as all other programs now, for some time, for several weeks, is about the general crisis in and around Ukraine. This global crisis which is affecting every part of the world, but which is overwhelmingly centered and focused on the events in Ukraine. Now, yesterday I discussed in my previous video about how there'd been an apparent escape attempt by Ukrainian troops garrisoned in the Illich steelworks, which has been completely surrounded by the troops of the Russian army military and by the forces of the Donetsk People's Republic. Well, that escape attempt was unsuccessful. Apparently, the Ukrainian troops were told that if they could break out, they could reach Ukrainian lines, which seems astonishing given that these Ukrainian lines are located 90 kilometers away, which does beg the question of how well informed the Ukrainian troops in Mariupol actually are about the overall state of the military situation. But anyway, putting that aside, there was this escape attempt. It was unsuccessful, and today we have information from the Russian Ministry of Defense that the bulk of what's left of the 36th Marine Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, the troops that were defending the Illich factory, have now surrendered to the Russians en masse. This is how the Russian Ministry of Defense describes this mass surrender. In Mariupol city, near the Illich steelworks, 1,026 Ukrainian servicemen of the 36th Marine Brigade have voluntarily laid down their arms and surrendered as a result of a successful offensive by the Russian armed forces and Donetsk People's Republic militia units. Among them, the Ukrainian armed forces have surrendered 162 officers as well as 47 servicewomen. 151 wounded Ukrainian servicemen of the 36th Marine Brigade received primary medical care immediately on the spot. After that, they were all taken to the Mariupol City Hospital for further treatment. Now, I want to stress this is information that's coming from Russian sources. I can't obviously corroborate it independently. I'm not there, but I'm sure that corroboration will be provided fairly soon because I have no doubt about the accuracy of this report. By the way, the Russians have released various videos which appears to show troops amongst Ukrainian troops, amongst these shots of these Ukrainian troops who have been surrendering. Now, this is by a very large margin the largest mass surrender of troops from either side in this conflict. And in fact, as various Russian commentators have pointed out, it is the biggest mass surrender of troops from any side of the Ukrainian conflict, going back to its very start in the battles that took place in 2014. And this is a big surrender of Ukrainian troops by any standards. Now, it seems likely that the 36th Marine Brigade, which is, by the way, a regular unit of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, is now all but destroyed. I think it's most unlikely that there are many remaining troops from this brigade left. And if it's true, as the Russians were claiming just a few hours ago before this surrender, that the total number of Ukrainian forces still fighting in Mariupol was up to 3,000, then of course something like a third of the remaining forces, Ukrainian forces in Mariupol, have now been put out of action and have surrendered, and presumably there's only up to 2,000 left, made up, I suspect, mostly of the troops of the Azov battalion, who are now basically restricted to the giant Azovstal steelworks. So this is a major surrender of Ukrainian troops. It is a further sign of the collapse of Ukrainian resistance in Mariupol. Now, I should say that President Zelensky, perhaps in anticipation of this mass surrender, produced showed photographs of what he says is the recapture of Viktor Medvedchuk, the Ukrainian opposition politician who had been arrested by Ukraine some time ago and charged with treason, who then escaped house arrest, or so the Ukrainians said, but who Zelensky now says has been recaptured, and who the Interior Ministry of Ukraine also says has been recaptured. Now, I had speculated that Medvedchuk had actually been sprung from house arrest by the Russians, but it's clear that that was not the case. And if he did indeed escape, as the Ukrainians claimed, then clearly he has been recaptured. I would say that there are suggestions now floating around the Runet that the whole story of Medvedchuk's escape was in fact something of a invention, and that he has been in Ukrainian custody all along. I'm not going to comment about that. I have no information one way or the other. The fact is that Zelensky, or at least the Ukrainian authorities, have now produced him. They've provided some extremely, I should say, harrowing and rather disturbing photographs of Medvedchuk in handcuffs. And Zelensky is now offering to swap him for Ukrainian prisoners in Russian hands. I don't know what the Russians are going to do in response to this, but anyway, we shall see. But I wonder whether this sudden production of Medvedchuk is partly intended to counter the effect of this mass surrender of troops, Ukrainian troops, in Mariupol. Anyway, we shall see. What I would also say is that there was yesterday, and in fact the day before, widespread reports, especially in the British media, that the Russians had used some kind of chemical weapons in Mariupol. This has now been not perhaps exactly denied, but the Pentagon has said that it can't confirm these reports. And in truth, there is really no evidence, as far as I can see, to support these reports. But it is the case, it seems, that a large number of these remaining Ukrainian troops, mainly from the Azov battalion, but perhaps there's still some people from the 36th Marine Brigade who are still fighting. Anyway, that these troops in the Azovstal factory, many of them are said to be hiding in underground tunnels and bunkers. And there's been some discussion about how the Russians and their allies from the militia of the Donetsk People's Republic intend to deal with these people. There's been some suggestions from the United States that the Russians could use tear gas or its equivalents to try to force them out. There's other suggestions that flamethrowers or thermobaric devices could be used. Lastly, I've even seen a report that the Russians might actually flood these passages and bunkers. All I would say is that, of course, none of this is confirmed, and I don't know what actually is going to happen. But personally, I would have thought that it would be extremely dangerous for these troops to hide in bunkers and passageways like this. I would have thought that there would be a real risk of entombment, and to be straightforward about it, I can't personally imagine a more grisly fate than meeting one's end underground. So I would suggest to the Ukrainian High Command that a much more humane approach would be to tell these troops to surrender as well, and to press forward with whatever trade there can be, whatever, whether it involves Medvedchuk or other prisoners in Ukrainian hands, so that these people are eventually both enabled to survive and are exchanged for, well, either Medvedchuk or Russian or militia prisoners. Expecting these men to fight to the death in bunkers and tunnels underground, presumably in darkness, it seems to me a deplorable plan, and one that no self-respecting commander should ever ask of his troops. I would say that in that Facebook message that the men of the 36th Marine Brigade published, which was reported in the British media yesterday, they speak harshly of how they feel that they've been betrayed by their commander-in-chief, who is presumably Zelensky, and I would hope that that advice from those troops is accepted by Zelensky and the Ukrainian High Command in relation to these troops who have just surrendered. Now, rather to these troops who are still holding out in the Azovstal steelworks. Now, I have to say that this has not been the pattern up to now. The Ukrainians have, on the contrary, seemed to show a willingness to go on fighting long past the point where there was really little point in doing so. And that seems to be the pattern of the battles that are raging across the Donbass altogether. But anyway, I would add that we've now had a report from a French journalist. I provide a copy of his an account of his report, which has appeared on Zero Hedge. But this journalist, who is Georges Malbrunon, is emphatically someone from what we might call mainstream media. He is apparently an independent journalist a journalist working for Le Figaro. He's their international correspondent. He has said that the United States, that people from the United States are directly in charge of the war on the ground. And this is how Zero Hedge reports it. Malbrunon said he had accompanied French volunteer fighters, two of whom had previously fought against ISIS. I had the surprise, and so did they, to discover that to be able to enter the Ukrainian army, well, it's the Americans who are in charge. Who is in charge? It's the Americans. I saw it with my own eyes. I thought it was the international brigades, and I found myself facing the Pentagon. Malbrunon also mentioned America providing Ukraine with Switchblade suicide drones. That, of course, we've already known about for some time. And then Malbrunon goes on to say that, citing a French intelligence source, Malbrunon has also tweeted that British SAS troops have been present in Ukraine since the beginning of the war, as was the case with American Deltas, and that Russia is apparently well aware of the secret war being waged in Ukraine by foreign commandos who have been in the region since February. Well, and Zero Hedge, in fact, provides copies of his tweets. And Zero Hedge then goes on to say both the United States and Britain have publicly asserted that there won't be troop boots on the ground in Ukraine, but apparently this has been a US-UK military presence. There's been a US-UK military presence since the start of the war. Polls show in the run-up to the war, the overwhelming majority of Americans wanted our government to stay out of it, but our leaders know best and are more than happy to risk World War III in defense of the Ukrainian regime. And that's a quote from somebody called Chris Manahan, whom I don't know who that is, by the way. But that's in the Zero Hedge article. Now, I'm also reading elsewhere, this time on Reuters, that President Biden is becoming increasingly focused on trying to get weapon systems to Ukraine that the Ukrainians say they need. And there's a report apparently out that the United States is now looking to provide heavy artillery to Ukraine from American stocks. And the nature of the artillery that's going to be provided are ATACMS missiles, surface-to-surface missiles, presumably to replace the Tochka-Us that Ukraine is now running out of. And this is apparently going to be announced over the next 2 days. And I'm getting increasingly the sense that President Biden is now heavily or perhaps overwhelmingly focused on the war in Ukraine, perhaps to the extent of exclusion from all other matters. And the extent to which he is becoming personally invested in this war is shown by a really rather, I thought, bizarre series of comments he made. He was talking about the increase in inflation, or purporting to. Inflation in the United States, at least the official figure, is now 8.5%, which I ought to say is strongly disputed by many other people. I'm not going to throw around numbers, but I think most people accept that the true rate of inflation is higher than this. Anyway, President Biden was supposed to be talking about inflation. In fact, instead of talking about inflation, he talked about President Putin, upon whom he blamed the inflation. And he even started to use the genocide word to refer to what President Putin is doing in Ukraine, something which the Pentagon, at least, has not confirmed, and which doesn't seem to be the official position of the US government. These supposed slips of the tongue by President Biden are, in my opinion, simply a reflection of his own personal, I'm going to say, obsession with this war. Now, obsessions of this nature are extremely dangerous, especially when they take charge of a president, of a US president. And I have to say that I'm becoming increasingly concerned that without realizing it, the United States is slipping into what you might call mission creep. It reminds me of the 1960s increasingly, and of what happened over the course of the Vietnam War. What happened during the Vietnam War was that the United States found itself supporting a government in South Vietnam that was unstable and had severe problems with corruption, and many of whose members were widely believed to be extremely violent and to be committing human rights abuses. Now, on the latter subject, I would say that the missile strike that took place a couple of days ago in a East Ukrainian town, I'm going to be extremely careful now what I'm going to say. It's becoming, I think, widely accepted that the initial claims about it, which attributed that missile strike to the Russians, well, let's say that they're looking increasingly shaky as photographs of that missile and its serial numbers are beginning to appear. Well, if that is correct, then that says two things. Firstly, that the Ukrainian leadership either has little control of where it launches its missiles to, or perhaps that some of its members are indeed extremely violent people. I want to stress this has not been verified. There ought to be, as I said, an investigation. But anyway, there are now good grounds for doubts. And yet, despite these doubts, the United States apparently intends or is thinking about providing these same people with surface-to-surface missiles of a similar nature to the one that was used against that East Ukrainian city. Now, I'm going to say a couple of things about this. Firstly, that seems to me extremely dangerous in and of itself, given the uses to which these missiles have previously been put or apparently put. Secondly, the Russians have shown an ability to destroy these missiles in the air. So the delivery of these missiles might not make the great difference that some people in the United States appear to believe. And thirdly, and most importantly, supplying these missiles, of course, is another major investment by the United States in the war, all the more so as apparently stocks of this particular missile system are not large, and the United States is going to be transferring, one assumes, more of these missiles out of these stocks, depleting its own. And this comes following reports that the United States has now provided so many Javelin and Stinger missiles to Ukraine that its own stocks of these missiles are now indeed becoming, these short-range missiles, these anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles, are now becoming increasingly depleted. Now, we also learn that there are now Americans on the ground in Ukraine. This has been provided to us by Le Figaro, by a reporter working for Le Figaro, and we also hear that there are American and British special forces operating in Ukraine. About that, by the way, I never had any serious doubts. Now, this does all remind me very much of the situation in the 1960s in Vietnam. There were American so-called advisors in South Vietnam, long before the United States started to send combat units there. The United States was supplying arms to this very unstable and corrupt government in Vietnam, South Vietnam. It was promoting a war, and it was finding that with every arms delivery, with every attempt to, with all the advisors that it was sending, that was not actually changing the actual balance of the war. South Vietnam was still losing. And of course, that eventually did lead to increasing mission creep, and the United States did become increasingly involved. Now, in 1965, the United States began to send ground troops to participate, to fight in the war. And of course, it then began a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam, Operation Rolling Thunder. Well, I hope that we don't get to that point, though goodness knows nothing now looks impossible. But I would say that the equivalent of the bombing campaign seems to me this extraordinary sanctions war, this economic war of attrition that the United States now seems to be fighting against Russia, which is increasingly looking to be the equivalent, if you like, of North Vietnam in this particular conflict. And what is happening is just as the bombing war and the supply of all those American weapons didn't change the results on the battlefield, at least not dramatically. They slowed down the advances of the North Vietnamese, but they didn't ultimately change the direction of the war. Not even in the end, the deployment of American ground troops was able to do that. What all that did instead was harden opinion, harden support for the continuation of the war in North Vietnam, and one gets the increasing sense that the same is happening in Russia. I'm increasingly seeing pictures, again, I can't corroborate these, but I'm sure that these are true. I don't think there is any real doubt that these are true, of Russian civilians coming out and cheering their troops as they advance towards the battlefront. And all the indications I'm hearing is that there is an increasing stiffening, an increasing hardening of the mood in Russia itself. Now, what also happened over the course of the war in Vietnam is that the president, in that case, Lyndon Johnson, began to become increasingly focused on Vietnam, almost to the exclusion of all other issues, even as his massive spending programs in the United States, and of course the huge increases in the US's military budgets, and of course its provision of military aid to Vietnam, and of course the increasing cost of the war itself, began to fuel an inflation crisis in the United States itself. And I have to say, I'm starting to worry that the same is happening this time with President Biden and his team. It's beginning to look to me increasingly as if President Biden is becoming so invested in this war and so obsessed with it that he's losing sight of many of the other issues, and is beginning to become obsessed about the war, almost to the exclusion of of everything else. So we have this odd thing where instead of talking about the inflation and the cost of living crisis and what he's going to do, he blurts into discussion about the situation in Ukraine and about what President Putin may be doing. And at a time of economic stress, the United States needs a president who is focused on that. And of course, what happened in Vietnam is that as the American political class and the military, by the way, and of course the general American population began to sense that the US government and the president was more focused on the war in Vietnam than on the situation in the United States itself, support both for the president, that's to say Lyndon Johnson, and for the war eventually collapsed. Well, history doesn't always repeat itself, but it does sometimes rhyme. And I would suggest that people within the administration look carefully at what happened in the 1960s. I've often said, and I've been saying this ever since the new administration came to office, that there's an awful lot about it that seems to me disturbingly like the kind of policies that an earlier Democrat administration in the 1960s, that of Lyndon Johnson, began to pursue, which created enormous stresses and problems in the United States and in the world economy. And I'm genuinely concerned, seriously concerned, that this current US administration is increasingly treading on the same path. Anyway, I hope that sounder counsels do prevail. There's a widespread view that there is considerable concern about this whole situation at the highest levels of the Pentagon, and we do see how the Pentagon does seem to be repeatedly acting like a force of restraint. It has, of course, spoken out against this claim about a chemical attack in Mariupol. But ultimately, it will be the US political class in its totality, and of course the American people themselves, who will have to decide where they draw the line under this affair, even as the inflation fires in the United States and the economic hardship which goes with that intensify all around them. Meanwhile, on the subject of Russia and the stiffening of the mood there, we've had a very strong public appearance by President Putin. He has resurfaced after a couple of days of being relatively invisible to the Russian people. He went to the new spaceport that's being built in the Russian Far East at Vostochny. President Lukashenko of Belarus, who's now his firm ally, was with him. Putin spoke with confidence about both the progress of the military operation, saying that things are progressing pretty much as the Russians planned that they would, and that people should be patient and understand that the operation is indeed proceeding according to the outline that the General Staff put to him before the war began. And he seemed pretty confident both about the progress of the operation and about Russia's ability to resist the sanctions pressure. In fact, he said that the blitzkrieg, as he put it, the economic blitzkrieg that had been launched against Russia at the end of February had failed. What he didn't say, but what is obviously true, is that Russia is now locked in an economic war of attrition with the United States. But he seemed confident that in time Russia would be able to overcome that too. And of course, the Russian Prime Minister, Mr. Mishustin, seemed to think the same. Now, that's not to say that the Russians are not running into problems. And here I'm going to say something. There's been a lot of discussion, for example, about how the Russians are going to experience problems with microchips. I have never taken that as seriously as some people have. But that doesn't mean that they're not running into some problems. And the Russian government, the Russian Industry Ministry, has, for example, spoken about a shortage of lithium in Russia. Russia does not mine its own lithium, though no doubt it could, but it is finding it difficult to access supplies in Latin America, even though it's on favourable terms with some of the Latin American states like Argentina, which do export lithium. But presumably the Western companies that mine lithium in Argentina and Chile and Bolivia are for the moment, withholding lithium supplies to Russia. Well, I suspect that the Russians will be able to overcome this problem. And I also suspect that the Russians, in their vast territories, will eventually find lithium deposits and that they will be able to start mining there. But we can see that these sanctions are not without effect on the Russians. In fact, they are having significant effects on the Russians, and it's not going to be easy for the Russians to substitute for all these products that they're now having difficulty accessing. But in time, overall, I predict that they will. I suspect that they have a better idea of how to counter the economic war which is being waged on them than some governments in the West do. And of course, one of the most interesting facts has been to see how President Putin and his officials have been holding meeting after meeting, looking at how to counter the sanctions pressure, how to stabilize the economic situation in Russia, how to try to plan ahead for it. And that does seem to me to show a contrast to the US president, to President Biden, who, as I said, is looking increasingly fixated with Ukraine and increasingly out of touch with the economic picture in his own country, or perhaps not so much out of touch, but perhaps somewhat disinterested in it. Well, anyway, we will see how things develop. There's been a lot of discussion, by the way, in the Western media now about the steady build-up of Russian forces in eastern Ukraine for the great offensive in Donbass. I read a really extraordinary article in the London Times, which I'm not going to provide a link to. It's behind a paywall for one thing. But there was an extraordinary article in the London Times which suggested that the Russians are looking to achieve an 8-to-1 superiority in numbers over the Ukrainians in Donbass. I have to say, I think that is wildly far-fetched. And I think this is a complete misunderstanding of how fighting is evolving in Donbass at the moment. But anyway, the focus remains on Mariupol. Once Mariupol is fully cleared, and as I said, the remaining holdout is the Azovstal steelworks, and to be frank, with perhaps 1,000, 2,000 Ukrainians bottled up there, it may be that the Russians will feel that they no longer need to keep the tens of thousands of troops stationed around Mariupol that they have been deploying up to now. So probably over the next couple of days anyway, some of those troops will be redeployed elsewhere in Donbass, and it's indisputably the case that more Russian troops are in fact arriving in Donbass. We shall no doubt be seeing more developments in the Donbass war over the next few days. Meanwhile, just to finish on military matters, Russian strikes continue all across Ukraine. These tend to be increasingly not just increasingly, they seem to be long-range missile strikes. Many people have been asking what the Russian Air Force is doing. Well, the short answer is they've been providing ground support increasingly to Russian and militia units in the fighting in Donbass. This is very much in keeping, by the way, with Russian doctrine. You use your long-range missiles to strike at ammunition depots and such things behind enemy lines, thereby, by the way, avoiding any mitigating against the risk of losing aircraft and valuable pilots, whilst concentrating your actual air force and no doubt the drones that go with it now against the actual ground positions of the enemy, which are in support of your ground forces. So that's where most of the Air Force is operating. And I actually read a report somewhere that a Ukrainian soldier has said that the single thing that the Ukrainians are most unnerved by is precisely the Russian Air Force, which is operating apparently with unrestricted force over the Ukrainians, over the East Ukrainian skies, over the Donbass skies. But anyway, the Russians continue their missile strikes all over Ukraine, very much at the same level as before. Claims that I constantly read that the Russians are running out of missiles continuously prove to be untrue. There was an article I seem to remember in the Daily Telegraph about 2 weeks ago, which said that the Russians were almost out of missiles because they were no longer able to make them because all the engines of these missiles were made in Ukraine. A completely wrong assertion, by the way, but there it is. The Russians are still able to launch missiles all over Ukraine. And by the way, they have also used hypersonic Kinjal missiles again. And this is important because, of course, if the United States does indeed try and supply ATACMS missile systems to Ukraine, well, the Russians will know where they are. And I strongly suspect that the Russians will be using their hypersonic Kinjal missiles to destroy them, as they've done on other occasions. And of course, neither Ukraine nor indeed the United States has any air defense against the use of these hypersonic missiles. So a growing, an accelerating collapse of Ukrainian resistance in Mariupol, Russian missile strikes across Ukraine, intensifying battles in Donbass, a gathering of Russian forces in Donbass, growing signs of mission creep on the part of the United States, and some rather disturbing indications that the President of the United States is becoming increasingly focused on Ukraine, perhaps to the exclusion of more pressing matters. Well, that's enough for me today. More from me soon. Thank you for joining me again today. Remember, you can find us on other platforms. There have been all sorts of things happening on some platforms, by the way, so just do bear in mind you can find us on other platforms too. So you can find us on other platforms. I mentioned Rumble and Locals at the start of this program, but of course we're not just on Rumble and Locals, we're also on other platforms as well. Links under this video. You can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video too. Don't forget to check out our shop where we have all sorts of great things: t-shirts, sweaters, hoodies, magic mugs, hats, scarves, all sorts of nice things. And of course, don't also forget to tick this like button to this video if you've liked this video, and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.